It's time for the Double Stop with Brian Sword.
Welcome to the Double Stop. I'm Brian Sword. This week, got a super cool interview for you. It's with producer, engineer, mixer Wyn Davis. Now, Wyn was really nothing more than a name in the credits of a bunch of my favorite albums. Dokken, Dio, Foreigner, just to name a few. I really knew nothing about him. So this interview is a real treat because he had a great story that's not really out there. Super nice guy to boot. So let's jump right into it. Here is Ronnie James Dio's favorite recording engineer, Wyn Davis.
Well, I was born in New Jersey, down in the extreme southern part of New Jersey, down near Cape May. And my parents moved to Texas, where my dad went to school. And then when I was 4 years old, they moved to California. And that's where I've been for the rest of my life. My connection to music, just came through my mother, basically, who was a church singer and a piano player. And my dad actually was the executive secretary of AFTRA, which is the American Federation of Radio and Television Artists. He worked for them for years. So I had this sort of peripheral connection to the music business because in those days, AFTRA represented primarily radio personalities and off-camera voice talent and singers.
All right.
So one of the first things I remember my dad doing when he started working for them is, like a lot of union guys, he would go and audit some of the things that were going on for the union to make sure that their membership were being paid properly and all that kind of stuff. And he had to go down to the record plant and check in on the Beach Boys, a session they were doing there. And I remember him telling me about it, and he could see I was really interested in it. And when he realized how interested I was, he said, "But let me just make something really perfectly clear. You should never be in this business. Don't ever go anywhere near any of this stuff." I said, "Okay, Dad," and then promptly, started a direct beeline for, please buy me a guitar, please buy me an amplifier, please buy me a better guitar and a better amplifier. And so that's how I got involved in music, is basically through being a musician and learning how to play the guitar and a few other instruments. I moved back to New York and lived there as a musician, and came back to LA in the mid-'70s, and by chance got involved with a studio in Hermosa Beach that ended up being the first place that the punk band Black Flag ever ended up recording their very first recorded material. And the guy I was working with liked my singing and he liked my imagination, but at one point he said, your songs are really not that great, but I love the way you put them all together. So would you help me, work with some of the people I'm working with? And I found myself just absolutely fascinated, and I found myself so happy being involved in all the nuts and bolts part of putting together the projects and stuff. And I was never really that well motivated as a show off, so I wasn't a very good performer, but I really loved being in the studio and figuring out different ways to get things done, running the machine at half speed, doing, various kinds of tricks and inventing things to make things happen in the studio that I thought would sound cool in a song or and that's how I got my start as an engineer, and and a producer, because that's what he actually told me. He said, you should actually be producing songs, not writing them. And I said, oh, really? A little disappointed, but actually, it was the best advice I was ever given. And I found a home doing that, and I've been happy doing that ever since. I stopped calling myself a guitar player about 30 years ago and transferred the name guitar owner.
Oh,
You know,
nice. Yeah, that
yeah,
sounds like it was a compliment, but it didn't feel like one when he said that you should be a producer.
yeah. Not at the time. It didn't. It felt like, oh, really? I suck. As all this time I've been spending back east and touring and playing club gigs and stuff like that. You're going to tell me that I actually shouldn't have ever done that. I should have just gone ahead and gone back to school and become an electrical engineer and then got in here and do this. Well, but in any event, I took him up on it. I actually, it allowed me, we did some demos for some people at a place called Media Art in Hermosa Beach. And that's where Black Flag started. And we did a bunch of demos for a bunch of the Plim Souls and some other early LA sort of new wave punk bands and stuff like that. And some of them got record deals. And that actually is what, sort of sent me down this path with more passion and confidence and a lot of enthusiasm.
Now, do you think the experience you had of being a musician and touring and playing, did that help you a lot when you decided to become a producer? So was that wasted or not?
I guess it was certainly wasn't wasted, but whether or not it helped, you would be some of the people that I've worked with think it did what is a big help, and some of the people I work with don't think it was that big a help. I think early in my career, when I was still working out my own frustrations as a musician, it didn't really help me that much because I still had way too many opinions about how I would do it if I was playing it or something, and wasn't able to get out of the way as much as I actually should have, and been objective enough to actually see what somebody else was trying to do, which came to me later and actually served them and me way better, than trying to sort of impose my own idea of what I thought, I would have done if it would have been me playing it or singing it or writing it or whatever. And I think that's an important distinction. At least for me, it is when I work with people and I watch producers. I think that the guys that I really love and respect and whose work I really admire are the guys who are able to do that, who are able to, sort of plug into what the artists are doing and what's great about them, and instead of expressing themselves through the artist. I mean, they're great examples of both of those kinds of things, but those kind of producers, the people who express themselves through the artists, are more like producers like David Foster and really high glossy pop producers. But that's not the kind of music I listen to a lot. So the people that I enjoy listening to are like you're one of the guys up there from. There are some guys up there in Canada that have done amazing work.
Yeah, I just had Mike Frazier on last week, and
Well, Mike is a great mixer, and yeah.
and obviously we had Bob Rock and Bruce Fairburn come through here. I'm in Vancouver, so
Oh yeah, right. Well, Vancouver is a great city. I really loved it. I went up there about 4 different times and worked with a band that was called Resurrection Mary, and they were a cool band, and I really liked working with them. And yeah, and those are good examples of guys who make the best of what they're given and encourage the best out of the people they're working with.
now when you started on the production side, so you've been told you should be a producer, and you start working with some bands. That's not exactly the stereotypical route through, whether or not you start as an assistant and work your way up. How did that work out for you?
It worked out. It was a strange path because what ended up happening was that um, I went I went from being sort of helping produce and I would occasionally play on the things that I was helping with, but mostly I was helping the guy who was engineering. Uh, his name was David Tarling, and I was helping him come up with ideas about how to make the recordings for the people that he was working with more interesting, sound better, uh, ideas about how to do miking, but it was all without any sort of proper training or anything. And long about that time, I ran into a guy who became like sort of a lifelong mentor and a very, very dear friend. And he was an engineer who's who started working at Abbey Road when he was like 17 years old and ended up doing a bunch of work with the Beatles and producing David Bowie and Supertramp and a bunch of those bands. And his name is Ken Scott. And Ken ended up being somebody who gave me a lot of foundational knowledge about audio engineering and because he came up through that sort of that system in Britain where you're a T-boy, you work in the tape library, then you're an assistant to the assistant, and then you're an assistant, and then you sit in the chair. And his first engineering gig, the way he explained it to me, was the guy didn't show up couldn't be there for the session or something, so he ended up being the mixer on I Am the Walrus. And yeah, right. That's a pretty good induction
Yeah.
into the engineering world. And he ended up, engineering the White Album and producing Ziggy Stardust and a whole bunch of other stuff. And he was in Crime of the Century and a whole bunch of records from that era. And a lot of those were sort of engineering landmarks of the time. And I was really lucky to be able to absorb a lot of knowledge from him because I acquired the studio shortly after I started trying to produce and engineer more formally, and he was in need of a place to work, and he ended up working here for about 25 or 30 years, and I learned a lot from him. He was one of the people who that I that helped me round out my technical knowledge about audio engineering with the musical imagination that I had brought with me.
And your period then in the trenches of working at a small studio and working with all the bunch of smaller bands, how long was that period?
So 77 to 81.
And probably worked with 100 bands and just honed your chops?
Oh yeah, that place was selling time at $25 an hour, and it was booked around the clock because it was one of the only studios in the greater LA area, or especially around here, that had a 16 track and then 24 track analog tape machine uh, for at those rates. And so people would come just so that they would get an opportunity to, you know, stack some stuff up, separate their tracks, because in those days that was a really, it was still a luxury to be able to work on multi-track tape recorders. So what we had is at Media Arts, they had a 16-track 3M and a 24-track 3M, and they would lock those up, and that would end up, giving you 32 tracks to work on, minus the 2 tracks that were used to synchronize the machine. So 30 tracks. And that gave us a lot of room for our imaginations to run wild because, records like of those days, like Dark Side of the Moon and stuff like that, those records were all made on, one 16-track tape recorder. So while we were, learning how to use those tools and listening to the work that other people were doing, we had this canvas that allowed us to do a lot of experimenting and a lot of figuring out how we could use all of that. And pretty irrelevant today in the world of Pro Tools, where you essentially have an unlimited amount of tracks on every track. I mean, the playlist mentality in Pro Tools it's a blessing, and it's also a curse for a lot of people. I've worked on projects where people have come in and asked me to comp a vocal, and I said, okay, sure, and they said it's on playlists, and I say, okay, no problem, and I hit the playlist open window, and the entire screen fills with row after row after row after row of takes, and I'm thinking to myself, really? I mean, there are, 100 plus takes here. You want me to go through every one of them to get a comp? So
you're not the first person to say that to me. That's funny.
I bet. Yeah. Well, that is the world that we live in now, and it doesn't. It's a different subject probably, but the art of actual capturing a performance that is in the moment is something that's being quickly lost in the world we live in.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's very, very quickly becoming something that is not even understood by the generation of artists and producers and creators. It's still out there, but it's not completely gone. But for the most part, the idea of, no, you need to play it right, and you need to, get it, pretty much like, let's just call it, 75% or, even 50%, right, all the way through down from the top down. It just doesn't even compute with so many young performers these days. They just like, well, why? Why should I have to do that? Why is that necessary? But all the records they reference and that they love were made that way, and it's hard to explain that sometimes.
I would imagine back in the early days with your studio, when you had bands coming through all day long, you would have had this wide range of skills, and that must have helped you as a producer and an engineer to work with these people of varying skill sets.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. And like anything else, when you're young and, you're full of yourself more than full of an appreciation for where you are, sometimes that can get in your own way. You think you have all these skill sets. I remember sitting with a guy once, and I felt like his guitar playing was not as good as it could have been, and I asked him, I said, hey, well, let me see your guitar for a minute. And he handed it to me, and I showed him something, and I gave it back to him. It wasn't, and then about a year later, I heard through the grapevine that how much he resented that, that he really felt like I had like sort of taken the guitar out of his hands in a moment where he really needed to be hanging on to it and sort of work through his own thing. And so we both learned something. I mean, he learned that to stay away from people who had their own agenda for playing the guitar, and I learned that it was a better idea to, help people work through their own moments, in the studio and get the best that they could be, and try and uncover that instead of trying to impose it on them. Because if you're going to try and impose a lot of stuff on people in the studio, what's going to happen is that you're just going to want to end up hiring a bunch of guys that can do it, instead of finding out what this person's capable of doing. And I think that that's an important part of recorded music and an artistic expression, of being able to see the world through the eyes of the person who's actually trying to create something.
Now, you said that you worked in that studio till about 1981 with a bunch of local bands and whatnot. What happened in 1981, 1982 that changed that?
this studio that I'm in right now was under construction. It was sort of like half built, and it was started by a guy. I mean, you've got to remember that the beach cities in 1981 in California in 1980, 81. I mean, just remember what time that was. We were at the end of we're sort of at the end of the disco age, but it was still going pretty strong. You know, it was pre Michael Jackson. You know, so the music business was in some sort of, you know, pretty heavy duty funk. And a lot of the people who were involved in the music business at that moment were, I'd say, uh, I'd say in some regards, losing their way, because this place was had found a bunch of investors, and and what happened was, you know, the guys got so wrapped up into the cocaine world of doing coke and drugs, which was a big part of the beach area. If you ever saw that movie Blow with Johnny Depp in it, that takes place in Hermosa and Redondo and Manhattan Beach, and you know, all this whole beach area. That's where that all, you know, that's where that was all spawns. That whole story takes place in these in this community. When I came, I found out that the place had gone into receivership, and when I went over to look at it, the guy answered the door, and he answered the door with an assault rifle with a banana clip in it, and I thought, holy mackerel! I just want to look at the console to see if, you know, if this is something we could use. And he said, "Come in," and he had like a huge pile of blow, and you know, and it was amazing. But the one thing that I did know was that the people who had invested money in the place had, you know, the way that a lot of studios were put together in those days were with equipment leases, and a lot of the people who had invested had a lot of the equipment that was already existing in the studio. They had their like houses and cars and savings accounts, you know, leveraged against this equipment that this guy wasn't making payments on. So I was able to talk to them and assure them that if they would, you know, turn over their interest to me, that I would be able to get them out of the predicament that they were in with these leasing companies, which I did. But it was a pretty crazy time. I mean, I really didn't have anything to lose. I'm amazed that they gave me the opportunity, but they did, and they all wanted to get out. So it wasn't too long. All I had to do was, you know, establish my own credibility with these leasing companies, and then you know, I was able to release all those guys from responsibility. And you know, it's funny, I'm still friends with most of those people, but they're not in the music business at all. They were glad to get out with their hides, so to speak. And the music business was still in a pretty bad funk. You know, I don't know how many people remember the early '80s for what it was, but it was pretty gnarly until Michael Jackson made Thriller, which really, I mean, completely rebuoyed the music industry in a way that very shortly after that, Def Leppard came out and sold 8 million records in, you know, a very short period of time. And those sorts of numbers uh, made the 80s and, you know, the early 90s and the mid 90s you know, some really boom years for a lot of people, a lot of, because it became really big business. It became big money, and it changed everything. I mean, when I started the studio, when I got the studio, there were probably 50 multi-track studios in Los Angeles, and then and after Thriller was out for a year, there were probably 250.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so it changed the landscape of. And today, you know, it's all the way back to where it was. I mean, the landscape of the LA music industry is, you know, the marquee studios are still there. There, you know, Capitol is there. Ocean Way's there, the Village is there. There's a few, Sunset Sound is still there, but a lot of the places that sort of represented where we're still at, and which is a one-room studio that concentrates on one client at a time, and is at a price point that makes it possible for just about anybody to come in here and do something. Those places are almost all gone. I mean, there are a lot of kids who do it in their bedrooms and garages, but it's amazing how many young artists come into this place today and look around and have an experience here, and they just come in, they just go, wow, I didn't know how cool this was.
Great.
They're just blown away by it, and it really reminds me of why I keep trying to keep this place going, because it is an experience that I take for granted, and a lot of people that I grew up with and worked with for my entire career take for granted, but it's something that most of the young artists today never get to experience, what it's like to actually be in a place that's designed to capture their performance.
Yeah, they're just used to the bedroom, right?
Yeah, with people that are dedicated to that end. I think the do-it-yourself world is full of really incredibly talented and creative people, but I have found that after a while, people just, when they have to manage all of the overhead, all the technical overhead, the computer overhead, the keeping everything running, getting the right mics, making sure that nothing gets erased, making sure their hard drives are backed up, it's an enormous amount of overhead for somebody who really should just be sitting there writing a song and getting better.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
And I think that I sort of feel like we're sort of coming to a tipping point with that, with a lot of people who are starting to understand and realize that they'd really rather have somebody else doing that, whether they have that other person doing that at their house or in a real studio or whatever. I'm not sure, but I do see more and more people feeling like, man, I just don't want to do this. I just want to play my guitar or my drums or sing, and have somebody else manage all this stuff.
Now, you have a few relationships. When I look at your history and your records you've worked on, you have a few relationships that have a lot of history, and one of them would be Dokken and the various members of Dokken, like Jeff Pilson. The first record that I see you worked on was Breaking the Chains, and how did you get involved in that project?
It's such a great question. Don worked with the guitar player from Paul Revere and the Raiders at the same studio that I was talking about, Media Art in Hermosa Beach. He was working with this guy. His name was Drake. I can't remember Drake's last name. He's passed away now, but he was a guitar player in that 60s pop band, Paul Revere and the Raiders, and he was producing a song for Don. And I had met Don at Media Art, and he was aware of this studio that I had taken over. And very, very shortly after I had gotten the keys to this place and had officially taken over, this was still in the days when there were payphones. I had a payphone in this place, and it rang, and it was Don on the other end, and he said, I need a studio. I'm going to need like 50 hours. And when he said 50 hours, my heart just started pounding, because I thought, oh, this is exactly what I need right now. I need somebody who's going to book some real time. And Don and I became, he came in and we became friends, and we started working on stuff that would eventually go on to be on some of his other albums. And he had brought his relationship with Michael Wagner. He had brought Michael Wagner to the United States, and Michael came in here, and I worked with him mixing that record, and because he had recorded it originally in Germany, but we wanted to remix it here and try and make it into something else, do a little better job mixing it, and conform it a little bit more to the market that Don was aiming at, which was the early '80s, hairspray metal market of the Sunset Strip. And so we mixed that record, and Don and I became really close friends, and I became really good friends with Jeff Pilson because, mostly because I wasn't, it worked out fine for Juan. Juan Crucier was part of the original band that Don brought in here, but for whatever reason, that didn't gel, and Jeff became part of the band for the very next record, and for the tour that supported Breaking the Chains. Juan Crucier went on to be the bass player for the band Rat, and which was also a band that was sort of founded and headquartered here in the South Bay. And there was a lot of that music down here. Great White was in here. They made like 5 records here, and Don and Michael Wagner's affiliation with the studio, which he moved out to the Valley, and as his star ascended into the multi-platinum firmament, he worked at a lot of different places, but we've remained friends over the years, and he got his start here, and we've always I've always really valued everything that I learned from Michael, and while he was here engineering and working with those bands that he was working with. I remember the thing that really helped Michael's career, I think, in the very early days, of course, Cliff Bernstein and Peter Mensch, Michael, talking about Michael, was giving him the opportunity to mix the Metallica record. But right before that, he actually was approached by Elektra to mix a song for the band X, which was a really prominent punk band in LA at the time. It had John Doe and Exene in it, and he ended up recording this song that's appeared in a bunch of movies, and it's the song Wild Thing, but it's done in with all this group singing, and it appeared in a baseball movie.
The Charlie Sheen one, yeah.
Yeah, and that's right. That movie, that's Michael's version of Wild Thing that he recorded here. And I remember him asking me, do you think I should get involved with this? This is sort of the kind of music that I usually do, because it's more punk and stuff. And I said, the LA press just loves this band, man. So I don't see how you could lose if you just go in there and do something great, something cool. It's going to turn out. You're going to get a lot of. You're going to make a lot of friends, and I think he did. And Michael's a really nice fella, and that was a good move for him. And every time I hear that song, I crack up because I remember, how he made it here, and it didn't appear on any of their albums, but I bet you it's made them a lot of money over the years.
Just that movie alone.
Yeah.
And another relationship that seems to have gone through the years is with Ronnie Dio.
In 1995, Jeff Pilson told me that, Ronnie was looking for, said, I think you and Ronnie would really get along great. And I really want him to come down and see your studio and meet you and see if and it was a long shot because, I live in Redondo Beach. I don't know if you know LA at all, but I live in Redondo Beach, which is in the south part of Los Angeles. And Ronnie lived in Encino, which is about 30 miles north of where I am. And it's 30 miles north on one of the most, horrible freeways in God's creation, the 405, which runs the spine of LA, from the valley all the way down to San Diego. But between where Ronnie lived and where I am, you're pretty much guaranteed just an awful drive every day, depending on is terrible. It's really it's remarkable because a lot of the people who've worked here the most lived the furthest away from here. Ken lived even further than Ronnie, and he ended up working here for 25 years. Uh, and Ronnie and I got along really well right away. I have Jeff Pilson to thank for that. He and I from the very early days of Dokken. Jeff just has a remarkably just in a remark. He's a remarkable person in every way. I mean, he's an amazingly enthusiastic, energetic person. And like all of us, through his youth, he went through a lot of different sort of phases, but he was always that guy. He always brought a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, and an amazing amount of talent to everything he was ever involved with. And when he brought Ronnie down here, Ronnie and I just hit it off. I mean, I was really surprised because, most of the rock people, I mean, by that time I'd been around the block quite a few times, and I thought I knew what to expect from a rock star. But, Ronnie was like no rock star I'd ever met. And I mean, he was such a whole person in every way. Miss him so much. He was a really remarkable person. And I think really single-handedly, he came into my life at a point where I was feeling so jaded and so not sort of losing my passion for what I was doing and sort of feeling like it was a lot of manufactured, sort of smoke and mirrors. And until I met him, when he came into the studio, man, this guy just brought every bit of real talent, real energy, dedication, devotion to his fans and to what he was doing in a way that even though when he came here for the first time, I'd never even bought a Dio record. By the time he had finished his first record here, I was like a complete, absolute, utter fan because of how good he really was. I mean, and how great he was as a performer and as a leader of people, and how great he was to everybody he came in contact with. He was really an amazing guy, and I miss him every day. I mean, I think about him all the time still.
And was that Angry Machines, that your first record with him?
Yeah, that was Angry Machines. That's the first record I got to work with him on. And, he and I worked together on every record he made after that. I mean, it was a simpatico that just worked for him. And I'm so grateful that it did because, Ronnie was one of those guys who would just make you want to do anything for him, whatever it was going to take to get what he was after, you'd chase it down with him. You wanted to because he brought, that kind of dedication himself. It wasn't like he was relying on you or anybody else to manufacture what was great about him. It walked in the door with him. I mean, all the way from, being ready to sing every single time anybody said, "Hey, Ronnie, are you ready to do a vocal or do you want to sing something?" Singers are a pretty fragile bunch of people. And unless, all the lights and cameras are on and all, tape is rolling, they don't like to be subjected to the sort of brutal, unforgiving lens of the studio microphone where there's nobody there except them and the microphone. Most singers, try to avoid that until there's no other choice. Rodney was not like that. I mean, first of all, he got here, he came to work, I mean, to the minute, on time, every single day, and was the first one here, the last one to leave. And and was always ready to sing. I mean, it was like he was never afraid of anything. I mean, and I had actually never been around anybody like that up until that point.
And he'd always had this reputation for never warming up before a show. How about the studio?
Yeah, no, I never heard him warm
He just
up.
had it, eh?
I mean, his idea of warming up would be like, going out and singing the whole song down. Okay, I'm ready now. You know, uh,
And was there a difference with working with him between a solo record and then Heaven and Hell?
well, there was because I mixed this. One of the things that I'll tell you, there's people talk about, important moments in their life or their careers or something. I mixed this record for Ronnie. It was a performance DVD. It was a live performance of Holy Diver in its entirety that they did at the Roseland Ballroom in New York before it was destroyed. And we worked really hard. It was a long and hard session. And when we were finally finished with the DVD, we were walking out of the control room door, and he stopped and he turned around and he said, "You know what? You are the best fucking engineer I've ever worked with, and I'm never going to work with anybody else." And I remember just that, sort of getting into my bloodstream, and it literally felt like the most amazing drug I'd ever taken. I mean, for somebody that I admired that much after working with him to turn around and make that kind of commitment to me felt like such a gift. And I know that when he got into the Heaven and Hell thing, there's a lot of give and take in those situations. They ended up recording that record in ended up recording most of that record in England, but he made damn sure that I mixed it. And he felt like, well, okay, Tony's going to have his guy record it, and we're going to be in England, but when it comes down to mixing this record, we're going to do it. I ended up recording a bunch of stuff here with Tony, and that was a great experience too. But I always felt I always felt so honored and loved by Ronnie, and I think a lot of people who worked with him felt that way because he, if you were there, for him, he was there for you, and he was like that for his fans. I always felt like, man, Ronnie's fans, if they knew what a great guy he is, they would be twice as happy to be a fan of his as they really are, because most of us hope that these guys that we're listening to on record are as awesome as people as they are, as musicians and songwriters. But, truth is, few of them really are. I mean, I hate to say it, but, everybody has challenges. And I think when you're faced with that kind of adoration that a lot of people, and the money and the pressure and a lot of people, at some level or another, whether it's personally or morally or, spiritually, they wilt, in one way or another. But man, Ronnie was a really remarkable human being, and he didn't. And he, if you were there for him, he was there for you. And as long as you were willing to keep bringing it, he would bring it. And I can't really say enough about how much I miss him.
And what did it mean for you then to be involved in the tribute record?
It was, it was nice to be involved in it. It was great to. I didn't get to actually work directly with Rob Halford because he was somewhere else at the time. So we sent the tracks to him. I loved working with Doug and the guys, and I liked working on the tribute record. But it was. The last time I worked with Ronnie, it was I don't know if they put the song on the tribute record or not, but I don't think so. I think it came out on something else, but it was a song called Electra, and it was supposed to be part of the next installment of the Magica trilogy, and that was the last actual whole song I worked on Ronnie. I also he came. I did also Mix of Heaven and Hell live DVD that was the last thing that Ronnie ever sang on a microphone. When he came in, he fixed, one really small thing. That was another thing. I'll tell you what, you go out and you listen to all the live stuff, all the live Dio stuff. I mean, before me and after me, there is almost nothing on those records that didn't go down, at least at his end, exactly as you're hearing it on those records, on those performances. I mean, very, very little touch-ups or, makeups or enhancements to any
Which
of
is
that
pretty
stuff.
unheard of
It's
nowadays.
just all, yeah, it really is. I mean, it's just amazing, and especially considering that when he did the Heaven and Hell DVD, if you pick that thing up and you listen to his performances on that, I mean, the man's like 65, 66 years old. I mean, come on. He's not a kid, man. And I think there's a scream on one of those songs. No, actually, I think the scream is actually a few years earlier in that. The first thing I did with Ronnie was Angry Machines, and the next thing I did with him was a live record that he had recorded over a number of shows, and it came out as a record called Last in Live, which was he has a scream on that thing that I think is, if you go on YouTube, it's listed as one of the 10 greatest rock and roll screams of all time. It's like some crazy, crazy, yeah, it's some crazy high scream at the beginning of one of his songs. It's so great. But, he did all that stuff all the time. And I saw him probably more than I've seen anybody else in every single show I ever saw him at. He was great. I understood immediately why he was able to work anytime he wanted for his entire career, up and down, all around the world, because the people who came to see him and paid their money to see him, they got what they came for every night, and he did not leave anybody disappointed.
Let's jump back to Jeff Pilson for a sec, because it's really interesting to me, and especially since you guys still work together so much, it's really interesting his growth as he's still a bass player doing his thing, but his growth into production. And you've worked with him so much throughout the years. What was it like from your perspective to see him have such growth?
Well, I wasn't surprised at all, because Jeff is he's like a walking music, nuclear reactor, man. I mean, the guy has enormous capacity to. I mean, if we called Jeff, he could describe probably 5 or 6 or 7 projects that he's working on simultaneously, along with holding down what essentially, as I see it, boils down to being the musical director for Foreigner. And he, not even counting that gig, which keeps him on the road like almost 200 days a year. He's got a whole bunch of different irons in the fire, and he's always been that guy. I mean, he from the very first time I met him, I mean, he's a great singer, he's a great writer, he's a great musician. He can play the guitar, he can play the piano, he's a great bass player. I mean, he is the quintessential, sort of. I mean, if I had a record to make and it was mine, I'd go say, Jeff, help me make this record, because he would be my first call too, because he's just an amazingly talented, and watching it was, I got to just say, it wasn't a surprise at all, because he was always that guy. I mean, just like all of us, he got sidelined into a couple of, weird episodes in his life. And I think that goes along with being the kind of sort of rock star that he was during, the 80s and 90s and stuff. But he was always that guy. I mean, he's a very hard worker, super dedicated. He's a great father and a great friend, and and an amazing musician all the way around. He is I mean, if you're going to work with Jeff, you're going to get something that you can be proud of, period. Whoever you are. And whatever kind of genre you're working in. I mean, Jeff has a musical vocabulary that, basically is, as far as I'm concerned, unlimited. I mean, I don't know how much, really serious jazz Jeff listens to, but take that out of it and take out, really schmaltzy, horrible country music, take that out of it. Everything else, Jeff is, his vocabulary in all those different genres and his ability to appreciate it for what it is and understand it and, is remarkable. He's just quite an amazing person. And, there are a lot of really talented people in the world of music and show business, but honestly, there really aren't as many as you might think that have the kind of capacity that Jeff does.
And with all the Foreigner releases, and there's a lot of live releases and whatnot, and you're involved in a bunch of them, what is it about your relationship with him that always makes him come back and bring you back into the fold?
Jeff talked for a long time about wanting to get me involved in the Foreigner world after he started working with him. And it took, it took a few years after he started working with him. I don't know, maybe two or 3 years for me to get an opportunity. But, that camp that's not Jeff's camp. That's Mick's world. And if you don't cut it, you're not going to be worried. It doesn't matter what Jeff says. And nobody really, there's two people that really matter in that world. And that's Mick, and to a lesser degree, Kelly, and even to a lesser degree, Jeff. But I mean, he got me the opportunity, and I just do the best work I can. And I take my, sort of initial marching orders and understanding of what we're trying to accomplish from Jeff. But really, it always has to pass through Mick's filter. And if it doesn't pass through his filter, you're done. And so Mick and I have developed a really good relationship since I started working with Foreigner, and that's pretty much why ever since I did the very first thing for them, I've pretty much done everything else that they have put out since then. I feel really grateful to have gotten the opportunity to work with them, and I'm going to Detroit this summer to do a whole acoustic live show with them, record an acoustic live show of all the Foreigner hits, sort of in the vein of the record we put out a few years ago called Acoustique. But it's going to be them doing it actually live. And, they're a really great live band. I mean...
Oh, yeah, I've seen them. They're great.
Yeah, I mean, really, seriously, Foreigner. I mean, I was a huge fan of theirs when I started this studio. And that wasn't really a popular position with bands like Black Flag, The Descendants, the Minutemen. Those guys were all totally anti all that kind of music. So that had to be sort of a guilty pleasure for me, in those days, because, but I did. I loved those bands, especially in Foreigners, early ascendant days when they were way on top. I mean, you couldn't basically turn on the radio without hearing their songs all day long.
When I was in high school, I was a huge Hurricane fan. So I was thrilled when Kelly got the gig in Foreigner, because I was a fan from way, way back, and he's been fantastic in that band.
And the funny thing about that is that I had this great band put together in the South Bay here between some really remarkable, great musicians who've all gone on to have pretty amazing careers of their own. But I had them all assembled into this one group of people, and the only thing we didn't have was a great singer. And Kelly lived in Hermosa Beach at that time, and he actually came over to the studio with the Hurricane record, the very first one, uh, to visit Don, and we listened to it in my car. And I remember that record was mixed, I think, by Tom Lord Alge and Chris Lord Alge's brother, who was at the time, the same sort of guy that Tom is now. He just basically mixed every hit heavy metal record that was coming out, and Kelly came over, and I remember thinking after I met Kelly all those years later that, man, I wish I had known you were in Hermosa Beach, man. We would have poached you for that band. Yeah, because he's a great singer. I mean, Kelly is a real singer. There's no BS about that, man. And when you go to see Foreigner today, I mean, if you love the band, he gives you what you came to see. I mean, that's really the best way to, he honors those songs and so well in so much. I mean, one of the things about, going to see a band like Foreigner with Kelly singing in it, and the way that band's put together now, is that, it is as great a representation of live representation of Foreigner as you're going to get anywhere. I mean, it is, and if they had all the original members in that band that had been there from day one, let's say, even though Foreigner actually went through a lot of iterations besides Mick and Lou, you wouldn't be hearing those songs the way you do now. I mean, they just, I saw Foreigner in 1981 at the Forum, and it was like watching paint dry. I mean, it really was like, I mean, maybe it was because I was going to see the punk bands and stuff at the time, but I mean, those guys looked like somebody had like stapled their feet to the floor, and, they were just, up there playing the songs, and they really weren't, and Lou really wasn't singing them as they were on the record. He was sort of stylizing them. You could tell he was bored singing them. He wasn't, and that's what I loved about Foreigner when I got to go see him for the first time in the lineup that they have now, was how great they do, what a great job they do of putting those songs and representing and honoring those songs that we all just, that, and every single person that I've ever taken to a Foreigner gig with me goes, "That's a Foreigner song? Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, and that one too."
It's kind of amazing the catalog they have.
Oh yeah,
man,
17 top 10 hits. Man, I mean, that's incredible.
And if Jeff Pilson's gonna be on the stage, there's gonna be a show.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Because he's absurd, the amount of energy he has.
Yeah, oh man, and he pays for it too. Poor guy.
Must. He must.
He does. Just everybody who loves Jeff, make sure you just go ahead and say a little prayer for him every day, because that guy, he gives it all, and he pays for it.
As we get close to the finish line here, I want to ask you about a record that I don't know if you get asked about it very much, but the album you did with Steve Stevens, the Black Light Syndrome album.
Oh yeah,
because you were heavily involved in that. And how did that project come together, and what was your experiences doing that record?
The way that I got involved with that record, the BLS record, was through Terry. Terry and I were old friends. Before I got this studio, I was running a rehearsal studio for my own band, and I had been introduced to Ken Scott, and I don't know if the history of Terry Bozzio is he had this band called Missing Persons in LA. Yeah, and so they rehearsed at my rehearsal studio, and Terry and I got to be good friends because we shared a passion for modern architecture. You know, we both, love Frank Lloyd Wright and Richard Neutra and a whole bunch of other stuff. So we had a lot to talk about in that regard. And years later, uh, Terry and Terry called me to help him do this thing called the solo drum project, which he put out a 3-disc set called Solo Drum Music, and it was sort of a instructional DVD slash artistic expression, and I worked hard on it with him, and I guess it did okay with him. So when it came time for them to put this record together, uh, he was involved. He's the one who got me involved, and my my experience with Steve Stevens was, sort of shaky, really. I mean, I didn't know him very well, and and I and I think because of the fact that I was Terry's guy, there was a little bit of there wasn't that level of trust that he would have had the guy working on the project been somebody that was his guy, I
Right.
guess.
Sure.
But we did end up getting along okay, and getting to the end of the record, and I had a great time doing it, especially. Loved working with Tony Levin. He was such a creative person. All three of them were really remarkable people, and that record came together from a uh, from tracking to mix down. I mean, the amount of stuff that those guys actually did after we were out of the initial tracking stages of the record was very, very minimal. I mean, they actually were able to capture that, and a lot of what ended up going, a lot of the work of the record went into sort of the mix side of it, trying to make sure that everything was captured and represented for everybody in a way that they felt was representing the ideas and the moment properly. And I actually really loved making that record. And Terry remains, somebody that I have immense respect for and an immense love for because I've known him for. I actually have a record somewhere in my files, a little single uh, that was the very, very first 45 that Missing Persons pulled out, and Terry pulled up to my rehearsal studio and he opened his trunk, and there were all these singles in there, and I said, "Well, let me have the first one," and he took it out and he signed it number one, Terry Bozzio. And so somewhere in my stuff there is this "Walking in L.A." single with, I think, that 45 had 4 songs on it, one on one side and 2 on the other, and uh, so he and I go way back, and I haven't seen Terry in quite a while, but I know that anytime I do see him, it's going to be like no time has passed at all, because that's just how it's always been with him. He's a really a remarkable, another very remarkable person in the music business. I mean, I don't know. I mean, people see his crazy drum set and they think, "Oh my gosh, what is this guy nuts, or is he an egomaniac or whatever?" But I tell you what, he knows what he's doing with every single thing on there, and there's a reason for every single thing there. Nothing that he does is uh, not completely thought through and doesn't have a very specific purpose for being there. It's not the way he works. It was a great experience making that record with those guys. I really loved doing that, and it started at this little studio because at the time my studio was busy in those days, so busy that sometimes I couldn't get in. So we actually started the record somewhere else and we finished it here. I mixed it here, but we recorded the initial tracks at another place. I can't remember the name of that place right now, but it was a place sort of similar to this.
It's kind of funny,
Similar
not able to get in your own
in,
studio.
Yeah, well, it was a good thing in those days. I always felt really lucky when that happened. I thought, wow, my studio's busy enough to where I have to go elsewhere to work. That's usually made me feel pretty good. Although I didn't especially like going someplace else because I was so comfortable. But changing it up is good for an engineer. I think that that's a big thing that if I'm going to close with one thought for anybody who's listening to this, man, change it up, do different stuff. It's really, really easy to get just so comfortable in the way that you do things. And I understand because it works and you get the you get the response you want from your clients and stuff. But, the passion and the fun of doing what we do is fueled by changing it up. Just mic your drums. Next time you mic a drum set, mic it with all different things. Something that you've never used before. Use different mic pre's, try something completely different and work through the problems that you encounter. And it becomes such a great part of the experience. And it takes you all the way back to when you weren't sure what was going to happen. And those days were always great too, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what it was about.
And for bands that want to work with you, how can they get a hold of you?
They can get a hold of me through our website. TArecording.com is the website, and there's a submission form there, and there's also contact information there. So, please send anything and everything to us because we listen to all of it and we love it all.
That was Wyn Davis. I hope you enjoyed it. Well, that's it for this week. If you like the show, please share it on Facebook and Twitter and help spread the word. I'll be back next week with another new interview. I'm Brian Sword. Thanks for listening.